Grocers and food retailers are preparing for a fresh round of new tariffs. In 2024, the U.S. imported more than $200 billion worth of agricultural products. According to the USDA, a large portion of those imports were fresh fruits or vegetables.
Where do pistachios come from?
They can't be easily produced in the U.S. That leaves sellers with little alternatives to higher tariffed goods. Joining me now is Abhi Ramesh, CEO of Misfits Market. It's an online grocery
California,
store that offers
they're fine.
sustainably sourced groceries.
We're good.
With a focus on rescuing food that might otherwise go to waste. Abhi, thanks for being here. So obviously, you guys are watching this very closely. How are you guys preparing for this, and what part of your assortment could be affected by these tariffs?
Yes, so we've been doing preparation work for the tariffs on produce specifically for a couple of months now. Obviously, it's been whether or not they're going to go in effect has been changing every other week. So it's been a little bit of whiplash. But a lot of it has been doing some planning with our vendors, with our freight providers, and coming up with kind of a pricing strategy internally as well. Today, at Misfits, we offer north of 1,000 different items in our catalog. It's probably around 40 of them that will be impacted directly by tariffs for Canada and Mexico. Now, these are also 40 of the highest velocity and most popular items, probably.
Okay.
So when you think about produce, a lot of the avocados, probably close to 90% of the limes that we sell in the United States, bell peppers, tomatoes, those are all items that, at least for this time of the year, are coming largely from Mexico. So those will be items.
Tomatoes does go into pizza, so that could affect me.
That will be mostly impacted. So we've been doing a lot of prep work on pricing strategy.
But tomatoes sauce is not an expensive part of pizza. The most expensive part of pizza is the cheese.
And working with our vendors as well.
And how about alternative supply chains? I was reading earlier this week in the Wall Street Journal about Chipotle trying to find other supply chains for avocados, for example. But the problem is that we in the U.S. like Hass avocados, and there aren't that many countries that grow them at this point. So have you been trying to diversify at all? And if so, have you run into some of those kinds of hurdles?
It's a great question. So we generally source in the U.S. When we can for most of our commodities. And so our team's done an excellent job of diversifying the supply chain and focusing on local growers over the past couple of years. The reality of the situation, though, which I'm not, which we've been spending a lot more time on, is
well, it would make sense that the produce is coming from closer areas.
A lot of the items that grocers and
I wonder what we get from Australia and New Zealand.
They can kind of only be grown in Mexico, given the growing environment. So let's use limes, for example. So people don't think about this, but close to 90% of the limes that are sold today in the United States are grown in Mexico. And it's not because people don't want to buy limes that are grown in the United States. It's that the very specific tropical or subtropical climate that is required to grow limes doesn't exist in the U.S. outside of a couple small parts in California and Florida. And so the vast majority of limes have to be imported from Mexico. So, we have been looking for alternative supply. We try to obviously source locally in the U.S. when we can, but I think a lot of other grocers and retailers are going to be the same boat, where some of these items you simply cannot source from the U.S. in certain times of the year.
Yeah, it's not a reshoring proposition here. So you talked earlier about your pricing strategy and having to sort of attack that. So are you planning to pass the full additional cost of those tariffs onto your customers?
So right now, our plan is not to pass on the full cost. Our plan is to probably pass on a portion of the cost. Now, Misfits is in somewhat of a unique situation because of the way we purchase items with our kind of rescue mission, our ability to buy opportunistically. We generally have a little bit more flexibility on pricing strategy than a lot of other grocery retailers. I think we're going to probably be able to shield our customers somewhat from the full burden of the tariff impact. That being said, I think consumers on our platform, plus probably any other grocery store, can more likely than not expect higher prices than before. And certainly on some of these commodities like avocados and limes and bell peppers and field
I don't get those anyway.
Where 80-90%
I'm fine,
of the
I'm
supply right now in the U.S. is coming from Mexico, and there's not a viable alternative.
Tomatoes, yes.
Consumers will see higher prices
but
more likely than not over the next couple of weeks.
And Abhi, just quick.
Good pizza is made with tomatoes that come from Italy anyway.
You guys have a direct line to your consumers because they are buying it directly from you online. are you going to tell them? Like, are you going to send a note and say, sorry, we're raising some of our prices because of what's going on with the tariffs?
We plan on being really transparent about it. All right. I think most consumers are really savvy. They're educated, and they also are interested in understanding what is going on in the food supply chain, and especially recently. So our plan is to communicate this transparently. Our plan is to probably send an email out, push notification out via the mobile app, and saying, here's what we're doing. Here's why. We've also generally kind of focused on storytelling to our customers, explaining how products got from the farm to their doorstep. So this is just going to be another piece of that story.
Abhi, thank you so much. Really interesting stuff, and good luck navigating all of it.
Really? People are running out to buy cars? I guess if the prices are going to go up.
US auto sales jumped during the first quarter as the prospect of big import tariffs loomed over the market. Figures out Tuesday show General Motors was the biggest winner, with a 17% surge in sales. It saw strong demand for affordable crossovers like its Chevrolet Trax SUV, which is made in South Korea. There were gains too for big Asian names, including Hyundai, Mazda and Honda. Hyundai Motor North America boss Randy Parker said the past weekend was the best he'd known for a very long time. He credited shoppers rushing to beat the tariffs. Now Donald Trump's new 25% levy on imported cars will kick in from April 3rd.
And this is very modest. And what we're going to be doing is a 25% tariff on all cars that are not made in the United States. If they're made in the United States, is absolutely
modest. 25%. That's a lot,
bro. That looks certain to drive a big spike in prices and a drop in sales as a result. The effect could be most.
That's terrible. That's crazy.
Pronounced for lower cost vehicles, where profit margin.
I don't even know how to explain it. If you wanted to buy a car, well, it's going to be good for us. It's going to be good for America. Bring manufacturing back here, sales here. But I like Volkswagens. Not that I would buy a new Volkswagen. But if you want to buy any nice European, I wouldn't buy a new vehicle. But if I was going to buy a new vehicle, I don't think it would be a new American vehicle. That's what I'm saying. So now, if you are buying a new vehicle, you're kind of forced into something American. Or else, get 25% less of the car in value. If you're getting an American car, you can get 25% more of your value.
Margins are tighter. On Tuesday, Mercedes had to deny reports by Bloomberg that it would halt all imports of its low-end models. Now the
that's what Mercedes is saying. If Mercedes low-end models, I don't know what, it starts at 60,000, something like that, probably. 25% of that. 15,000. Yeah. So now a $60,000 car automatically becomes 75,000, and they don't even want to bother bringing them there anymore because they know no one's gonna buy it. Because for $75,000 of a comparable American car, you can get so much more value, features, technology.
Fear is that some Americans will be priced out of the market altogether, with the average selling price of a new car already nearing $50,000. If that drives buyers to look for used vehicles instead, then second-hand prices could also jump. Overall, Tuesday's figures show US new vehicle sales for the quarter hit 3.91 million units, or almost 5% up on this time last year.
A cold wind cuts through the ragged tents of Hooverville. A mother huddles over a makeshift stove, stirring a pot of watery soup. She remembers the radio's advice: stretch the food, make do. She tries her best, but she knows it won't be enough. Not for her children, not for her husband. Standing miles away in a bread line, his once proud suit now caked in dust. This was America in the Great Depression, a nation brought to its knees. And all this devastation was caused by something you weren't expecting: tariffs. Or was it? Did tariffs really trigger the worst economic disaster in modern history, and could they do it again? We're breaking it all down on today's episode of The Infographic Show. Did tariffs really cause the Great Depression? You've probably heard of the Great Depression, everyone has. Stock market crash, bank failures, millions unemployed. By 1933, 1 in 4 Americans was jobless, and it wasn't just factory workers or farmers. Even doctors, lawyers, and upper middle-class professionals saw their incomes plummet by up to 40%. Families who once lived comfortably suddenly found themselves struggling to survive. Their savings were wiped out, their futures uncertain. It was a time when make do or do without wasn't just a saying, it was a survival strategy. Families stretched every meal, patched and repaired old clothes, and walked miles instead of driving. Because with unemployment at record highs, owning and fueling a car was a luxury few could afford. The financial strain tore at the very fabric of families and communities. Divorce rates dropped, but abandonment skyrocketed. Men, ashamed and frustrated by their inability to provide for their families, often disappeared without a trace, leaving their wives and children to fend for themselves. To understand how things got so bad and what role tariffs played, we have to go back, way back, and not just to 1929 when the Great Depression began. No, we're talking about the depression that started it all, the one history barely remembers, the Forgotten Depression. The Forgotten Depression lasted just 18 months, from January 20th to July 1921, but it
couldn't be that bad.
The U.S. stock market tanked by 47%, and corporate profits plummeted by over 90%. Unemployment hit nearly 12%. It was just 1.4% during World War I. In the aftermath of this war, the U.S. faced a tricky transition. Factories shut down, 1.6 million soldiers returned home to flood the workforce, and inflation soared. In response, the government slashed spending by a staggering 75% and hiked interest rates to a steep 7%. The result was a 32.5% collapse in industrial production, the worst in history at the time. Prices plunged over 15%, and businesses failed en masse, leaving millions struggling to survive. The real turnaround came when President Woodrow Wilson cut federal
How did all this happen in 8 months?
spending by 65%, from $18.5 billion to $6.5 billion. This austerity helped stabilize the economy and eventually fueled the Roaring '20s. By March 1921, Warren Harding had taken over, and his presidency was marked by important change: the return to higher tariffs in the U.S. The U.S. has had a turbulent relationship with tariffs. One moment it's championing free trade, and the next it's slapping high tariffs to protect domestic industries. It's an economic roller coaster, swinging between protectionism and open markets, depending on the political and economic climate. Protectionism refers to government policies that restrict international trade. Think of it as putting up a fence around your country's economy to shield local businesses from foreign competition. That idea is simple. Limit imports and domestic industries have a better chance to thrive. Imports can be restricted in several ways. Tariffs are arguably the most common among them. Tariffs are essentially taxes on imported goods that make foreign products pricier, encouraging people to buy local instead. America's early days were heavily marked by protectionism. However, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the U.S. was riding high on relatively free
There's got to be a way to balance it so that it's not up and down all the time.
trade, with an understanding that international commerce made large-scale wars too costly.
But it's easier said than done.
The Simmons Tariff of 1913 was the one to break the tradition of protectionism by lowering tariffs and introducing an income tax. This was a bold step toward free trade, but it didn't last long. World War I put nations, including the U.S., straight back into a protective mindset. By the time the U.S. emerged from the war, the political landscape had changed. European economies were recovering, and U.S. industries were facing new competition. American farmers who had been selling crops to Europe during the war were now losing those markets as European agriculture bounced back. To protect American industries and farmers from competition, the Emergency Tariff Act of 1921 was passed. But that was just the beginning. The real game changer came in 1922. During Harding's presidency, it was the Fordney-McCumber Tariff Act, which raised tariffs above levels seen in 1913. This law wasn't just about higher rates. It also gave the president the power to adjust tariffs by as much as 50% to balance domestic and foreign production costs. The goal was simple:
50%.
protect U.S. industries from foreign competition. But there was a catch. The Fordney-McCumber tariff had an unintended consequence. It crippled European exports to the U.S. With fewer American dollars flowing in, war-torn nations struggled to pay off their debts, deepening economic tensions. Instead of helping the global economy recover after World War I, the tariff made things even worse, creating friction between the U.S. and its allies, and slowing down Europe's post-war rebuilding efforts. Meanwhile, in the U.S., tariffs kept creeping up through the 1920s. These increases had a major impact on global trade, creating a skewed relationship between the U.S. and its trading partners. By the early 1930s, the world had fully embraced protectionism, and the U.S. had set the stage for the trade battles that would shape the global economy for years to come. This brings us to the very beginning of the Great Depression, a moment when the world seemed to spiral into chaos. The 1920s had been a decade of wild growth in the US. These roaring 20s were like a fever dream. Everything was booming: new cars, radios, household appliances. Americans were buying it all. And they weren't just buying goods, they were pouring money into stocks. People were in a
Where did
frenzy,
everyone get the money
jumping
from?
into the market with both feet, hoping to get rich quick, and fueling a market boom that seemed unstoppable until it wasn't. Stock prices skyrocketed. The Dow Jones Industrial Average, the stock market's key index, soared nearly 162% in just 5 years. But as anyone who's been on a roller coaster knows, what goes up must come down. And this
I
ride
don't like
was
roller
about to
coasters.
crash hard. And the ride would start going down in October 1929. That's when the unthinkable happened. The stock market crashed. It all started on October 24th, Black Thursday. The market began its freefall, and the panic spread like wildfire. A brief rally followed, but that was a false hope. By Black Monday and Black Tuesday, the damage was irreversible. The Dow plummeted, losing nearly 90% of its value over the next few years. The American dream turned into a nightmare for so many people. But the crash wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. Once the market collapsed, everything else followed. The economy froze, banks failed, businesses went bankrupt, people lost their jobs, consumers, seeing their wealth vanish, simply stopped buying. Factories and stores shut down, the whole country ground to a halt. And let's not forget the farmers. They'd already been struggling with overproduction after World War I. Crop prices were falling and they had debts they couldn't pay. It was a perfect storm, and it was only getting worse. Then came the fateful decision from the U.S. government. President Herbert Hoover, who had already enacted several major policies, decided to sign the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act into law in 1930. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act was often called one of the most
Smoot-Hawley.
catastrophic acts in congressional history. And that is not just political rhetoric. That is straight from the official U.S. Senate website. When even Congress admits that they messed up, you know it was bad. But how did the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act earn such an unflattering reputation? Well, it didn't happen by accident. This was a slow-motion train wreck years in the making. It was the culmination of years of escalating protectionism, political maneuvering, and let's be honest, a whole lot of economic short-sightedness. We've already talked about tariffs being a favorite tool of policymakers looking to shield domestic industries from foreign competition. But compared to what was coming, those earlier increases were just a warm-up act. When the Great Depression came, everyone in Washington was panicking. Desperate for a fix, lawmakers turned to an old familiar trick: tariffs. And that's how the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act came to be. The bill was originally meant to help struggling farmers by raising duties on agricultural imports. But as with most things in politics, it didn't stay simple. Lobbyists for various industries saw an opportunity and jumped in, tacking on protectionist measures for all sorts of products. By the time the bill was finalized, it wasn't just about farming anymore. It was a full-scale tariff hike on over 20,000 foreign goods. It's no surprise that roughly 1,000 economists literally begged President Hoover not to sign it. But despite his own reservations, Hoover went ahead anyway, officially signing the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act into law on the 17th of
It's
June
Smoot-Hawley, you
1930.
have to.
But other countries weren't just going to sit back and take it, and that's the thing about tariffs. They often come with unintended consequences. And so Smoot-Hawley ignited what economist Chris James Michener called the mother of all trade wars. 9 countries, Argentina, Australia, Canada, Cuba, France, Italy, Mexico, Spain, and Switzerland, retaliated almost immediately with tariffs directly targeting U.S. goods. Canada's response was particularly filled. After all, the country was America's biggest trading partner at the time. In 1929, 18% of all U.S. exports went to Canada, and 11% of U.S. imports came from the country. That economic relationship was obliterated almost overnight. Initially, the Canadian Prime Minister at the time, William Lyon Mackenzie King, slapped tariffs on just 16 American products. But when R.B. Bennett took over in 1930, he cranked up the pressure. Canada raised tariffs even further on U.S. goods, while simultaneously cutting tariffs on roughly 270 products from the United Kingdom and its dominions. By 1932, Canada hosted a massive trade summit with the other British territories, laying the groundwork for a trade bloc that actively excluded the U.S. Essentially, America's protectionism pushed Canada right into Britain's arms. Canadian exports to the UK surged, especially in agriculture, the very industry Smoot-Hawley was meant to
Trying to control things, you bring about exactly what you were trying to avoid. Why was that so small?
protect in the US. But this was just the start. A total of 25 countries would eventually strike back with tariffs of their own. Countries already struggling from the Great Depression suddenly faced even higher barriers to selling goods to the US, making an already bad situation worse. US exports to retaliating nations fell by 28 to 32%. Even countries that didn't retaliate still cut US exports by 15 to 23%. Global trade collapsed, dropping by 66% between 1929 and 1934. One country hit particularly hard was Germany. Already drowning in debt from World War I reparations, Germany relied on exports to earn the money needed to pay its bills. Smoot-Hawley cut off one of its key revenue streams, worsening its economic crisis.
Damn Smoot-Hawley.
Nobel Prize-winning economist Paul Samuelson described it best. Cynics were delighted at the spectacle of a country trying to collect debts from abroad and at the same time shutting out their import goods that could alone have provided the payment for those debts. In other words, America wanted its money but refused to buy anything in return. Germany's financial collapse didn't just deepen its suffering, it paved the way for Adolf Hitler's rise to power. With the economy in ruins and desperation at an all-time high, extremist voices suddenly didn't sound so extreme. As businesses crumbled and unemployment soared, Hitler's promise of economic revival and national strength became terrifyingly appealing. Less than 3 years after Smoot-Hawley was signed, Hitler was the Chancellor of Germany. But the backlash against Smoot-Hawley wasn't just economic, it was also political. 35 governments lodged formal protests against it, and nations even formed new trade alliances to deliberately exclude the US. This fit right into the broader trend of American isolationism in the 1930s. But this kind of economic nationalism wasn't new. The phrase "America First" was already commonly used at the time to describe protectionist policies. Despite President Woodrow Wilson winning the Nobel Peace Prize in 1919 for creating the League of Nations, a forerunner of the United Nations, the US never even joined it. Smoot-Hawley only reinforced this isolationist stance, making America seem less cooperative and more self-serving. But all this doesn't answer the main question. Did tariffs really cause the Great Depression? It's easy to assume that the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930 only made the Great Depression worse, especially since the crisis officially began in 1929. But the reality is more complicated, which is why the true impact of tariffs on the Great Depression remains a topic of debate even today. Economists hold different views of the matter. Some argue that Smoot-Hawley was the spark that ignited the Great Depression, turning a recession into a global catastrophe.
You could
But
argue
what about the timeline?
both
If the stock
sides
market had already crashed,
forever, and
was
you'd
the
never
tariff
really
to
know,
blame?
because
Or was it just pouring
it's
gasoline
an
on an
8-dimensional
already
chess
burning
game.
fire? Well, before the tariff was signed into law in June 1930, the economy was struggling. There's no doubt about it. However, there was still hope for a recovery. But then Smoot-Hawley slammed the brakes on global trade, cutting off U.S. businesses from foreign markets just when they needed them the most. The ensuing trade war slashed U.S. exports from $5.2 billion to just $1.7 billion, a massive 67% drop. And the hardest hit sector was agriculture, the sector Smoot-Hawley was trying to protect before all the lobbyists got involved. Crops like wheat, cotton, and tobacco, which relied on international demand, demand were hammered, pushing farmers into bankruptcy and causing small banks, especially in rural areas, to collapse. But that's not even the most shocking claim about tariffs causing the Great Depression. One economist, Jude Wanniski, claimed that the stock market crash of 1929 was actually triggered by tariffs. Well, the anticipation of tariffs, that is. According to Wanniski, the market started anticipating the act as early as December 1928. That's almost 8 months before Hoover even signed the bill into law. It's as if Wall Street could sense the impending protectionist storm, and it panicked. This view suggests that the mere fear of looming tariffs was enough to spook investors. This triggered a chain reaction that ultimately led to the stock market collapse and the official start of the Great Depression. But let's turn the lens to the other side. Some economists argue that the Depression was already underway by the time the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act took effect. This would mean that the tariffs didn't cause it. By 1930, when the bill was passed, unemployment was already climbing, the stock market had already shown signs of instability, and the economy was already heading south. The proponents of the theory point to the fact that the exports only accounted for about 7% of the US GDP in 1929. So how big of an impact could the tariffs really have had? Remember, the US had raised tariffs in 1922 too, and it didn't trigger the Great Depression then. In fact, some argue that the Depression caused the decline in trade, not the other way around. Many experts agree that Smoot-Hawley didn't directly cause the Depression.
Damn,
it just made
Smoot-Hawley.
an already bad situation worse. You can think of it like this. The Depression was already a storm cloud hanging over the economy. Smoot-Hawley was the lightning strike that turned it into a full-blown thunderstorm. So it didn't create the storm, but it definitely made it worse. It caused the whole vicious cycle of retaliation, where one country raised tariffs and others strike back. As a result, trade shrinks and the recession deepens. Smoot-Hawley was a disaster. It's as simple as that. Even if it didn't single-handedly trigger the Great Depression, it definitely made things worse. The sharp decline in global trade, the collapse of agricultural exports, and the retaliation from other countries all point to one undeniable fact. Protectionism simply doesn't work. It's like trying to save a sinking boat by patching one hole while drilling another. So whether the tariffs were the final straw, the main cause, or just a bad idea that added fuel to the fire, one thing is for sure, Smoot-Hawley should have never happened. President Franklin Roosevelt realized this almost immediately. That's why he set about fixing the damage, working to undo Smoot-Hawley's catastrophic effects as soon as he took office in 1933. And his response to the tariff disaster was bold and swift. The New Deal, Roosevelt's game-changing blueprint for America's recovery, wasn't just about saving the banks and putting people back to work. It was about shaking things up and tackling the issues that the Smoot-Hawley tariffs had messed up in the first place. And one of Roosevelt's biggest moves was cutting down those sky-high tariffs that had caused an international economic food fight. Remember, the Smoot-Hawley tariff strangled global trade and dragged the economy even deeper into the mess. So Roosevelt's plan was to do the exact opposite. One of his boldest moves during these efforts was the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act of 1934. This wasn't just a tweak to the system, it was like hitting the undo button on the disastrous protectionist policies that had been put in place. Roosevelt had the authority to negotiate directly with foreign governments, cutting tariffs on both sides of the Atlantic. His goal was to break the cycle of retaliation and get trade flowing again. After all, a world that is trading is a world that is thriving. Roosevelt's act set the stage for the U.S. to pivot from isolationist policies to becoming the global champion of free trade. So in the years that followed, the U.S. took the lead in establishing major international trade agreements, including the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or GATT, which later evolved into the World Trade Organization, or WTO. By tearing down tariffs and opening the doors for international cooperation, President Roosevelt showed that protectionism wasn't the way out, it was the way to stay stuck in a never-ending economic slump. But while Roosevelt's efforts were crucial, the real end to the Great Depression came with an unexpected twist: World War II. When the U.S. entered the war in 1941, something dramatic happened. Unemployment plummeted from a staggering 8 million in 1940 to just over 1 million by 1943. But in reality, more than 16 million Americans were conscripted into the armed forces. So real private sector unemployment actually stayed a lot higher than those numbers suggest. After World War II, international trade channels opened up and reversed those crushing price and wage controls. Suddenly, there was a massive demand for cheap goods. The government, as a huge buyer, gave the economy the much-needed fiscal
Cheap
stimulus
car.
it had been
Give
missing.
me car.
This jump-started industries, created jobs and paved the way for private investment to surge. In fact, private investment shot up from $10.6 billion in 1940 to $30.6 billion just 1 year after the war wrapped up. By the end of the war, the economy wasn't just back on track, it was booming. The stock market went on a bull run, and things started looking up for the American public. And that's what ended the Great Depression. The economic shift triggered by wartime demand, investment, and global trading channels. However, just because the US managed to come out of the Great Depression doesn't mean the road was a smooth one. Quite the contrary, it was rocky, treacherous, and full of lessons that frankly we would rather not repeat. The damage done by the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act was catastrophic, and the scars from that period are still a part of economic history. So let's be clear, no one, and we mean no one, would want to go down that road again, right? Well, it turns out history isn't as far behind us as we might have hoped. Just when we thought that we learned the painful lessons of the past, tariffs are making a dramatic comeback. The US administration's rhetoric about tariffs today even has a certain nostalgia to it. The latest approach to tariffs isn't just about protecting US industries from foreign competition, it's about using tariffs like a weapon of power, aiming them at Canada, Mexico, China, and even Europe, all while claiming that these measures will improve the US standing on the world stage. Tariffs are being used to force political concessions like immigration control or geopolitical leverage, but history has shown that tariffs are a risky game, and that is putting it mildly, especially today.
Yeah,
Unlike the
we're
pre-World
headed
War
for
II era, the
Great
global
Depression
economy today is
2.0
far more
reloaded.
interconnected. Complex
B2.
supply chains, particularly between the US,
Wait.
Canada, and Mexico, mean that even small disruptions
New
can cause
DLC?
major ripple effects, and that is where things get complicated. This isn't just about damaging one sector or one country, it's about jeopardizing entire economic ecosystems. When one domino falls, the ripple effects can be felt worldwide. America's tariffs, especially the ones imposed on China, could lead to real economic downturn. Experts warn that these moves could raise household costs, shrink U.S. economic output, and even trigger a broader trade war that could make the global recession of the 1930s look like a mild inconvenience. And while it's too soon to say whether these tariffs will push us into a Great Depression 2.0, the potential for a repeat
That's what
of
I
history
said,
is
2.0.
undeniably there, especially if retaliation from other countries turns into a full-blown tit-for-tat. The America First approach might seem appealing in the short term, but if even a sliver of the chaos from the 1930s comes back, we could be facing a far grimmer reality. We can only hope that we've learned from those past mistakes. Do you think the Smoot-Hawley Tariff helped trigger the Great Depression, or was it just one piece of a much bigger puzzle? Could we be headed for a Great Depression 2.0?
Smoot-Hawley
Or do you think
MFer
other factors
ruined
would have to
everything,
line up
bro.
before we reach that level of crisis? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Now go check out What If the US Imposed 100% Tariffs, or click on this video instead.
That Smoot-Hawley ruined everything.